Little known fact that people are unaware of is that burning coal and the particulate matter that comes out actually puts out more radiation than what has ever been released, I think, in any nuclear disaster as well. So not only are we putting out bad particles into the environment, we're also radiating ourselves with coal remnants as well.
That's actually crazy. I had no idea.
Yeah, I didn't know that.
Chalk it up. Another point for nuclear. Welcome back to another episode of the Fifth Wall Climate Podcast, where we bring you the latest advancement on climate tech and all things climate news related. I'm Christian Thatcher.
I'm Cedric.
And I'm Francesca Whitehead.
In today's episode, we will discuss the EU's race to renewables and what that would mean for the European climate startups. We're also going to be looking into why monks are the perfect example of consumers that benefit the most from solar panels. If you're excited about these topics, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for our weekly episodes. Let's jump into the European Union first. There were multiple articles talking positively on Europe's efforts to speeding up infrastructure for renewables so that they can stop relying on oil and gas, obviously given the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. So Cedric, you want to set the table here on this episode for us?
Yeah, absolutely. So before the Russia-Ukraine war, status quo, about 40% of natural gas and 20% of European oil imports came from Russia. As we all know, the Russia and Ukraine conflict kicked off, and as a result, the European put sanctions on Russia imports and tried to, essentially cut off this energy supply. And we all know what happened to the resulting energy prices. There was a supply squeeze, and energy prices just went through the roof. Roll the clock forward a year, Europe has been able to do an impressive and speedy transition to renewables, where now solar and wind makes up a bigger percentage of the European energy mix. So huge move by Europe, and I think only one that the US can hope to replicate in the near term.
I guess, Fran, too, bringing you into this conversation, you have family, right, in Europe. You grew up, or at least did some schooling in London as well. What was this crisis like for those that you knew and even yourself personally?
Yeah, I would say kind of the big impact that I saw from just talking to family members is just how much the prices actually went up. I think we saw a portion of it in the US where gas prices for cars did spike quite a bit during the kind of initial periods of the conflict. But it's not as stark as what happened in Europe.
Interesting. Yeah, I heard lots of stories too, but knew that some of your family was over there, so I'm sure you got a lot of good anecdotes from that, or maybe not good, but bad. Let's take a quick detour and explain really quickly to why using coal for energy is actually really bad. Fran, you want to take that one as well?
Yeah, for sure. So scientifically, burning coal emits toxins and carcinogenic substances into the air, water, and land. And so obviously that's really bad for all of us, for kind of the average person, for the animals that we're eating, and even the food that's grown.
Yeah, even from just like a non-climate, perspective, it's just very bad for just like human health. There's the black lung effect from all those coal miners back in the day. The more we can get away from these energy sources, for sure, the better, even if you don't care about the climate, I'd say.
The black lung, as Zoolander stated.
I've got the black lung, Pop.
I think I'm getting the black lung, Pop. It's not very well ventilated down there.
Exactly. But the other thing I want to add to that too is not only is it bad just in terms of breathing in, but a little known fact that people are unaware of is that burning coal and the particulate matter that comes out from burning the coal actually puts out more radiation than what has ever been released, I think, in any nuclear disaster as well. So not only are we putting out bad particles into the environment, we're also radiating ourselves with coal remnants as well. So
that's actually crazy. I had no idea.
Yeah, I didn't know that.
Fun fact for the day. Chalk it up. Another point for nuclear.
On the flip side, why do people still use coal? It's obviously the cheapest source, but also it's one of the easiest plants to turn on. If you kind of have a spike in demand to keep prices relatively low, you turn on a coal peaker plant. Because I think that's kind of helpful context to why it's still used.
It's one of those baseload powers. Same thing with natural gas plants, right? You literally just, put more gas in and burn more gas and you spin a turbine, right? Like that's how we're creating electricity, whether it's wind, blowing a turbine, or water spinning a turbine, or natural gas or coal, right? Creating heat or steam that is then used to spin a turbine. That's the thing that I hope Europe is careful with as they transition into, a broader set of renewables, is that we've watched like even this year with Texas, right? One of our team members was living in Texas and was out of power for like more than a few days just because some like big storm came out and they're off of the national grid. Texas is not connected to the national grid in the United States. And then they have so much solar and wind power. But then when like the solar panels, for instance, get covered with snow or damaged by hail, or the wind's not blowing, or it's just nighttime, then all of a sudden you don't have power. And so what people do to supplement that is bump up the baseload powers of coal plants and natural gas and everything. One other, or go ahead, Fran.
Or even the duck curve in California. That's less of an issue now, but it certainly was a really big problem a couple of years ago.
And so one other question on this that I just had, but we talk about like the technological advancement that's going to drive the prices down for solar, right? Like we've seen the cost curve for solar, batteries, right? It's all getting way more cost competitive. There's still work to be done there. But why are energy prices going up so much when like the share of renewables is also skyrocketing? Do we have any insight into that side of things?
Going back to that basic supply and demand piece, is that our demand is increasing pretty rapidly as we're trying to electrify away from kind of a lot of those traditional uses. Populations are growing. All of that is just putting more and more strain on the grid. And I think particularly in the US, I'm less familiar on the European grid in this, but the US grid is also just old at this point. And so it just needs to be upgraded in general to manage a lot of the load of what we're talking about here.
I think there's a lot of kind of soft costs involved too, right? With the workforce transition to these, renewable jobs away from the oil and gas or even coal industries. It's just, how do we take all of this incumbent labor and talent and, teach them, train them, essentially just transition them to the green economy. And so that also, I think, is adding to the kind of total cost.
Yeah, and I think, energy. Or go ahead, Fran.
For sure.
Yeah. I was going to say, and I wonder who's actually going to help fund that process. Like I've started seeing some startups pop up that are trying to help with that transition, because to your point, Cedric, there are so many people that could do that. If you're a mechanic right now, like why couldn't you become a mechanic for electric cars? And that's just one of many examples, of course. It's really the question of who's actually going to fund it. Is it the people making the electric cars? Is it the government? Is it just like people on their own dime? All of those are kind of questions that I think are unanswered.
No, definitely.
For sure.
And one other thing too is with some of these renewable assets, right? Like a solar farm, for instance. If you go build like a massive solar farm, you can't put that like in a city center. So that means you got to go where there's a lot of open space. You build it out there, then you have to build in the infrastructure. So I think there's going to be some of these like short-term or near-term costs to build out this new renewable infrastructure that's going to just inevitably be passed on to the consumer. But once those systems get built out, once the utilities and the power lines and everything that's needed for like the infrastructure side of things is built out, then we'll hopefully long-term see those costs continue to come down and really see that transition. And then the last thing I would add to this is I don't know the exact prices. I would have to look it up, but I think coal just in general is just also just super cheap. So anytime you're replacing that cheap of power with anything else that's more expensive, just naturally the prices are going to go up, but then hopefully we'll continue bringing the cost curve down.
And it's only cheap if you're not considering obviously the negative externalities. Technically, it's not that cheap.
No, totally.
Well, I'm curious just because, Fran, you're off to London in, call it a week or so. Things are starting to warm up, but like, are you concerned about, these energy issues at all?
Yeah, no, I definitely am. I think just like as you're going to actually have to live through it, it obviously becomes much more stark. Like so far, I've really been hearing anecdotes and reading stories as we all have. So that's definitely something I am concerned about. Hopefully less of an issue if I'm in the office, but certainly kind of from my own home perspective, of course. And also just given as a renter as well, I don't really have a good grasp of, what are my options that I can have if there aren't already solar panels or something on the building that I'm staying in.
Yeah, that's true. Well, you're going to be working so much that I
Yeah.
think you'll probably
Yeah,
be
just
living
keep sleeping in the
so
office.
it doesn't really matter, right? Yeah.
Exactly.
Just,
Yeah.
yeah, pack a sleeping bag.
Exactly. I think the place I'm looking at is only about like 15-minute walk away from 15 to 20-minute walk from the office. Perfect.
Problem solved. Just pass on the utility cost to fifthwall.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
No, that's great. It's been a crazy climate year in Europe. I think, we've had, a 500-year drought in Europe this year. There's obviously the terrible conflict going on between Russia and Ukraine. Hopefully these governments and policies will all move towards, a broader adoption of renewable technologies.
Agreed. There's also even kind of more issues as well. It's like things like Brexit, just like limiting the free movement of labor as well. There are so many jobs that require different types of people and folks to move around. And also, even in the US, we saw it during COVID, like migrant workers coming for farming couldn't get here. And so there was just huge strain on even like food supply chains as well, kind of broader than just energy, but all of them are sort of interconnected to just increases the challenges that people are experiencing.
Just a
on
quick
a day-to-day.
take from you going off of that too, Cedric and Francesca. Do you really think that gas is going away? Like the article in Vox talked about Germany like doing a really quick turnaround to do some ports that would be able to take in like liquefied natural gas. They're building out that infrastructure. Is that infrastructure just redundant, or do you think that gas is going to be here to stay? What are your thoughts on that? And I've got a hot take on this too.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's probably fully going away in our lifetime. I think there's just a long tail of applications that, is best suited for oil and gas or LNG. But that said, I think there's a lot of interesting technology approaches and developments that's happening to, either augment, or substitute these fuels with like SAFs of the world or e-fuels, things like that. But I think there's so many incumbent interests that it's going to be an uphill battle to completely remove it.
Yeah, I think I would largely agree. And I also think as well, in general, as we kind of saw at Texas, that like a diversified base is pretty important. And of course, we want the mix to be largely renewables, but there's some portion I think that will kind of remain one of these other solutions. And also you kind of want at least some of them as an option once in a while. What if there is suddenly a huge spike? And it'd be great that you could have a kind of, not great, but it's nice to have the other option of like a coal peaker plant in the case of Texas, for example, because then it could have lowered those energy costs and, that people's utility bills could have been more reasonable.
And yeah, I think, what I'd hope to see is, before my hot take,
Christian,
what I'd hope to see is these
hot take?
These coal plants is... There's actually another article this week. I'm forgetting. I'll have to look it up. I'll send the link later. But someone did research and like listed out all the coal plants that would be viable locations for new nuclear plants. So you can just like switch, the infrastructure's already built there, switch those coal to nuclear, and that would just have massive emissions reductions and would, hopefully reduce the cost of build out because the infrastructure's already built around that coal plant. My hot take on this is I actually believe, where we do need a transition off of oil and gas, I do believe that oil and gas is part of the clean energy transition, right? Like there is a total hierarchy to these things. It's like coal is worse than oil and gas. Oil and gas is worse than solar and wind, right? Solar and wind, to be debated, could be better or worse than like a nuclear power source, right?
Yeah,
everything comes back to nuclear. Yeah.
Hey, as long as we talk about energy.
Nuclear. I would say I did write wrote a high school paper about nuclear and how much I thought it should be sort of used for our base load. And so they could replace natural gas.
Yeah, no, like it's definitely a combination of like wind, solar, nuclear, batteries. I mean, you can think of nuclear as a battery too in many forms, especially some of these new SMR applications. But what I want people to understand is that like in the United States, especially, our transition, like the majority of our emissions reductions have been from the transition from coal energy to natural gas. So when like any president gets up there and says, look, we've been reducing our emissions from like whoever's the president at the time, like they all say it, right? That was driven by like the transition to natural gas. And so, but like that's not enough. We need to do the next step. And then I think we also need to be conscious of all these developing countries, right? Like our economies were all built off of fossil fuels. And then we're going to go and tell them, hey, like all the benefit, all the growth we've had from these fossil fuels, you're not going to get any of that. We're going to skip you to the transition. I just don't think it's going to be that smooth. And so I believe it's part of it. And hopefully, like Cedric brought up, there's going to be some, more circular aspects to fossil fuels, right? Like some of the companies we've seen that, are literally pulling, carbon out of the air or from industrial processes, and then we'll be able to make sustainable aviation fuel or sustainable diesel or just regular gasoline for driving cars. And so I think all of them part of this solution, but that's kind of like my take here on this. And I feel like it's going to be a very long transition off natural gas, but love the efforts of Europe for trying to make accelerate that.
So I feel like this is a conflict I always kind of think about myself, just like having grown up in like Vietnam and Hong Kong. But I think when you think about building greenfields, so a lot of these countries have no infrastructure in place for energy. And so building green is cheaper and faster and easier to do than what we're trying to do, which is switch our existing grid over. And so there's maybe some benefits almost for them not kind of already have that existing system. And also people don't have pre-existing assumptions or biases to what already exists because there isn't anything that exists. So that could actually make it an easier transition for them. But I totally agree with you that the fundamental thing is like, if that is the cheapest and best way for them to grow quickly, like who are we to say, sitting in like New York and San Francisco here, like, no, you can't do that. Like, who are we to say that in my mind? And it's also kind of unfair because we created most of the problems, not us, but like where we're sitting, right? We are the people who are the biggest drivers. And there's some indicators, I think like living in a city plus also wealth is a direct indicator for how much you're going to emit. Like it's a direct correlation. And so kind of with all of those things in mind, you're like, well, shouldn't we be taking more of that burden anyway? But of course, then we'd lose the climate battle. So we can't fully kind of have that mentality as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a perfect segue.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say.
Story, right? Of like leapfrogging these fossil fuel energy sources to renewables. This article on Bloomberg came out recently. A super rural Chinese monk temple just installed a few solar panels and finally have their kind of off-grid electricity. So I think that's kind of like a perfect case study of the leapfrog of to renewables.
Yeah. And I think maybe going back a little, even just like the philosophy of, I think a lot of these monks is to kind of live clean, live a simple life. And also just like kind of managing all of the things themselves. Like a lot of them farm themselves and kind of have remote communities. So I kind of like this microgrid kind of solution that they have. And I imagine we could actually use it in a lot of parts of the US too, just kind of some of the more rural areas where like a lot of them probably use backup generators. Like why couldn't they switch to this? Or even like Native American communities, for example, like Native American tribes. It'd be great if they could kind of have a full grid that they get to control themselves. And why not?
Yeah, no, just to play devil's advocate, I was thinking about this and it's like, there's obviously, the obvious kind of low hanging fruit of like more convenience and just more comfort and even just like warmth for sleeping through these winter nights. In my very limited knowledge of monks and Buddhism, but do you think a certain aspect of this kind of goes against the philosophy where, part of becoming a monk, kind of that lifestyle is living, to the barest bones and kind of like, living off the land, living very simply? Do you think this is kind of anti-monk, if you will?
I guess it depends what they're using the energy for, right? If they're using it to power their iPhone, then probably. But if they're using it, in my mind, to make sure they have clean drinking water, then probably less so. So there's that part. I also think it probably is helpful that if they do want any form of energy, it doesn't put a strain on the grid because of how remote that they probably are. They're kind of managing it all themselves.
Yeah, 100%. I was just...
Let me take a quick step back here. I want to go back to what Fran brought up earlier in our conversation. It may be that these renewable solutions or decentralized renewable solutions are actually the perfect solutions for, developing nations or specific use cases like the Chinese monks, like we've been talking about. And it says that they're currently just burning wood and collecting water from snow melt for their heat and their cooking. And so no government essentially is going to spend the money to build out, super expensive infrastructure to, for instance, wire power up the mountains, maybe in this case, or to very remote areas just to power a base of people that probably are not going to be large payers or provide a lot of capital return for those energy products. So having electricity in terms of just shipping a solar panel to them is actually probably the best solution that there is for them. Everything else is kind of cost prohibitive.
I would say the kind of only thought back I have on that, because I totally agree, it's a great microgrid solution in that kind of small little community area like that. But one of the challenges is that we didn't do that in the US, right? Like there's some cases we did, but a lot of parts of that are very remote within the US still have access to the grid if they want it. And in my mind, there's kind of an equity question that's at play there, because it's like, oh, we just don't want to deal with you. We don't want to build out the grid to like service you. Or we're going to say everyone gets access to power. That's sort of a basic right that we as a government have decided we're going to provide. I don't think there's a kind of a right or wrong answer as to which way about they go. And maybe the government can say, okay, we'll provide you solar panels instead. But kind of interesting how different countries have played that out.
You know what they do need, and this is a shameless plug warning, but they need some source panels there. You know, they got solar panels for their energy. They need source panels for their water. And I think they would be good to go.
Why don't we throw out some other things that they should also put out there? I feel like they should also get some heat pumps going with seals. And stand for electric panels.
It's our whole portfolio. Yeah.
I think it'd be great. And they definitely build nice homes with our modular solutions too. We got Vive, we got Icon, we got Assembly. They can all help out. Yeah, there's a fifth wall care package. Exactly.
So yeah, if you're a monk and you're listening to our podcast and you want a sustainably built home of the future, well, you know who to reach out to, and feel free to hit us up and we'll see what we can do on that end of things. All right, that's it for this week's episode. If you made it to the end of this episode, we appreciate your viewership. Don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button so you can see all of our new content coming out, and we will see you next week.